Do you ever think about cheating on an FAA rule when you're flying? Today we have two stories about cheating on the rules. One is about a surgeon who crashed his Bonanza and died. The other is about one of our Patreon supporters who was about to cheat on a rule when he said that he heard my voice. And we have a third story from a pilot who said that listening to Aviation News Talk may have saved his life. And I'm midway through an 8-day Vision Jet trip crisscrossing the country, so stick around to hear these stories and more. Hello again, and welcome to Aviation News Talk, where we talk general aviation. My name is Max Trescott. I've been flying for, 50 years, and I'm the author of several books and the 2008 National Flight Instructor of the Year. And my mission is to help you become the safest possible pilot. Last week in episode 326, we talked with Jason Stevens about what it's like to tow gliders and how you can become a glider tow pilot. So if you didn't hear that episode, you may want to check it out at aviationnewstalk.com/326. And if this is your first time listening to the show, welcome. Great to have you here. Now, if you would take a moment and touch either the subscribe key, or if you're using the Apple Podcast app, the follow key, so that next week's episode is downloaded for free. But first, let me remind you that this is a listener-supported show, and we have some new ways you can show your love and support for the show. Just go out to our support page at aviationnewstalk.com/support, where you'll find links to support the show via PayPal, Venmo, Zelle, and Patreon. And when you make a donation, I'll read your name on the show. Coming up in the news for the week of April 29th, 2024, a tornado wiped out 31 planes at a Midwest airport. A glider pilot crashes while scattering ashes. And we'll tell you about the unusual thing that TSA found in a passenger's pocket. All this and more, and the news starts now. From AOPA.org, warnings from the National Weather Service saved many lives in tornado outbreaks, in which 5 were killed and more than 100 injured in Oklahoma, Iowa, and Nebraska. One of the tornadoes on April 26 struck Epley Field in Omaha, leaving ravaged hangars and tangled aircraft. Stephen McCoy, Chief Information and Development Officer for the Airport Authority, said the passenger terminal area was not impacted at all, but things were very different on the GA side, where several hangars were damaged or destroyed along with 31 aircraft. We're sifting through the debris, McCoy said 3 days after the storm. We've been working with the original aircraft owners, giving them briefings. They're also working with their insurance company. And if the podcast app that you're listening to this on now displays images, you'll see a rather sad photo of a Cirrus Vision jet that was damaged by the tornado. From skynews.com.au, this comes from Australia. Family friends killed in glider crash at Victoria's Mount Beauty Airport were scattering ashes of the passenger's father. The community is reeling from the untimely loss of Greg Wanless and Kate Callingham, killed after their glider crashed in Australia as the pair's tragic final act comes to light. The pair were killed in a glider crash in the small northeastern Victorian town of Mount Beauty after a flight to scatter ashes of a mutual contact. Kate Callingham, 39, and Greg Wanless, 73, died after their motor glider nosedived and crashed near the tarmac of the airport. Both occupants were declared dead at the scene. The pilot had set out on the flight to dispose of the ashes of his late best friend, Max Callingham, who was also the father of his 39-year-old passenger. The 73-year-old was a seasoned power glider pilot. The 39-year-old was a new mother, having just given birth 5 months before. Early reports suggested the aircraft flipped over after crashing into a paddock at the airfield. And I wanted to mention this article because I've read several stories in the past about pilots who got into trouble trying to scatter ashes from an aircraft. In each of those cases, when the pilot opened the window, the ashes began swirling around the cockpit, making it difficult to see and breathe. So, in general, I'd recommend that you not scatter ashes from an aircraft. From uk.investing.com, federal court to cannabis pilot, no more transporting weed around Alaska. The FAA revokes license, though pot is legal there. The owner of Flying High Investments, LLC, faces the loss of his pilot certificate after transporting cannabis within Alaska. The FAA revoked his certificate despite the pilot's argument that since cannabis is legal in Alaska, its transportation should be legal as well. The trouble began when the FAA discovered that he was using his private plane for cannabis distribution following a report from the state's Alcohol and Marijuana Control Office. For starters, he allegedly violated tracking requirements. While cultivation facilities must adhere to strict protocols known as seed-to-sale tracking, the pilot misrepresented his transport methods, triggering the investigation. He also claimed that because Alaska hadn't convicted him of any wrongdoing, the FAA had no right to revoke his certificate based on punishable actions. The Ninth Circuit rejected his arguments of misinterpreted law and overstepped authority and upheld the FAA's decision. The three-judge panel found that the Alaska law legalizing marijuana distribution did not override federal law that criminalizes the action. Judge Ryan D. Nelson wrote, although many states have legalized recreational marijuana, it continues to be a controlled substance federally. The court opinion also ruled that even if his plane was only used within the state, it's considered an interstate form of transportation. Even if an airplane like a car is mainly used for intrastate activities, its operations could substantially impact interstate commerce, the panel found. The FAA's action indicates a strict stance against such offenses, suggesting possible legal consequences for the pilot beyond having a certificate revoked. As a federal crime, distributing marijuana via aircraft, whether the pilot meant to break the law or not, could carry a sentence of at least 1 year. And the irony of all this is that just a couple of days ago, the Associated Press reported that the DEA is planning to move marijuana from its current classification as a Schedule I drug, alongside heroin and LSD, and move pot to Schedule III, alongside ketamine and some anabolic steroids. From GeneralAviationNews.com, 3 injured when pilot loses control while landing. The pilot reported that he had texted his girlfriend, who was waiting for him at the airport in Calhoun, Colorado, to inquire about wind conditions. She sent him a photo of a rag in her hand that was not moving, so he assumed the wind was calm. Upon arrival at the airport, the reported wind was 220 at 10 knots, gusting to 20 knots. As he approached runway 15 in his Piper PA-28, he chose to fly a faster approach speed to allow for a quicker go-around if needed. So apparently he had listened to the ATIS to learn that and didn't rely just on the text from his girlfriend. And by the way, the wind was 70 degrees from the runway heading, so almost a direct crosswind. He stated that as he touched down, a gust of wind pushed the airplane off the runway toward the hangar. Though he knew he hit ground signs, he attempted to go around, but was unable to avoid the hangar in front of him and hit it with the left wing. The pilot later stated that he was unable to maintain control of the airplane during the landing and go-around attempt. Video surveillance of the accident showed the airplane cross the runway threshold and remain airborne until past the first taxiway and appeared to touch down near the second taxiway before it bounced. It then exited the left side of the runway into a ditch where the landing gear hit a sign. The pilot and 2 passengers sustained serious injuries. Probable cause, the pilot's failure to maintain directional control during landing, which resulted in a runway excursion. And I've looked at the flight data for this accident at 200 feet AGL, which was the last data point. The aircraft was doing 87 knots ground speed, and its airspeed was probably faster because there was some headwind component. About the fastest approach speed I've seen listed for a Piper Dakota was 78 knots, though some pilots use lower approach speeds. So this aircraft was at least 10, maybe 15 knots fast. And excess speed is a factor in many landing accidents. So I encourage you to fly your published airspeeds and don't just arbitrarily add speed because you think that more speed is always better when you're landing. Of course, if the winds are gusting, you may want to add half the gust factor to your approach speed. From AINonline.com, PlaneSense adding virtual reality cockpit trainer. Fractional aircraft provider PlaneSense has partnered with VR Pilot on a virtual reality or VR cockpit procedure trainer for its nearly 300 pilots. The Portsmouth, New Hampshire company operates a fleet of 43 Pilatus PC-12 turboprops and 14 PC-24 twin jets. With the VR Pilot solution, PlaneSense can efficiently provide in-house cockpit familiarization instruction to new hires and upgrading captains. Dubbed VR Flow, the platform will enable the Pilatus operator to add more dimension and functionality to flight crew instruction while also reducing the cost and complexity of training at different locations. From Fox56News.com, former Kentucky air ambulance pilot sentenced after flying helicopter while drunk. A former air ambulance helicopter pilot has been sentenced to 8 months in prison after pleading guilty to flying while drunk in December. According to his civil complaint on March 21, 2023, the pilot, age 47, was flying Aerovac 79 from Baptist Health Corbin to the University of Kentucky Medical Center with a patient on board. While en route, the helicopter began suddenly dropping altitude, triggering numerous terrain warnings. All attempts to communicate with the pilot failed for several minutes until he responded and leveled the helicopter out. Court records show that the pilot was once again rendered unresponsive and appeared to be slumped over at the controls. After several more minutes of little to no response from him, the crew attempted to force him to end the flight. They eventually falsely claimed that the on-flight nurse was having a medical episode and an emergency landing was required. Records show that the pilot was very confused while trying to land and nearly collided with 2 aircraft before successful landing. After the landing, medical testing found that his blood alcohol content was 0.35, more than 4 times the legal limit. In other news from BusinessWire.com, global aviation services provider ASL Aviation Holdings and Reliable Robotics announced that ASL has placed a deposit-backed order for 30 units of the Reliable Autonomous Flight System for the Cessna 208B Caravan. ASL and Reliable have been working together since 2022 to bring advanced automation and remote piloting into ASL's operations and have a shared goal of expanding the program to include additional aircraft. From avweb.com, a Florida company says it plans to electrify 2 iconic amphibious flying boat designs. Maxwell Aircraft of Bartow, Florida, says it will develop electrified versions of the Lake Renegade Seawolf and the Gooey Duck that's somewhere between a widgeon and a goose in size. And from aviationsourcenews.com, Joby Aviation celebrates a major milestone with the groundbreaking of its pilot production line expansion in Marina, California. The ceremony not only marked the groundbreaking of the Marina facility, it also showcased Joby's second production prototype aircraft, fresh off the pilot production line. And finally, from nz.news.yahoo.com, man tries to board flight with snakes in his pants at Miami Airport. A plane flying out of Miami International almost had a group of slithery travelers on board. TSA announced on social media that a bag of snakes was found hidden in a passenger's pants at a checkpoint on Friday, April 26th. The passenger hid the snakes in a small green camo bag. TSA officials gave a glimpse of the bag through 3 different photos included in their post. According to the announcement, officials from the U.S. Customs and Border Protection and the Miami-Dade Police Department were called to the scene, and the snakes were turned over to the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. WFTV reported that the passenger was attempting to go on an international flight and was denied boarding after the snakes were found. The U.S. Department of Transportation explains on its website that, quote, federal and state governments impose restrictions on transporting live animals. In addition, each airline establishes its own company policy for the proper handling of the animals they transport. And no word on whether these were emotional support snakes. Well, that's the news for this week. Coming up next, a few of my updates. And then we'll talk about some of the poor decision-making that led to a fatal crash of a doctor in his Bonanza in Kentucky. All right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And now let's get to the good news. First, congratulations to Patreon Mega supporter Kevin Henriksen. He passed his Cirrus SF-50 Vision Jet type rating a couple of weeks ago, and he and I are now flying around the country, getting him the additional 25 hours of time that he needs, and I'll tell you more about that in a few minutes. Also, congratulations to Mega supporter Jim Goldfuss for completing his training to become a Pilatus PC-12 pilot at PlaneSense, and he has aspirations to move up to the PC-24 jets that they also operate. And congratulations to Andrew Nagungi, he says, passed my private check ride max, and still learning more, instruments, and most from you. Thank you. Well, you're very welcome. Congratulations to all of you. And here's a story I just got a few minutes ago from Ed Kelly, who's one of our Patreon Mega supporters. Here's the text that he sent. He says, I wanted you to know that I really appreciated your latest podcast about breaking or not breaking FARs, and your statement stuck with me. Quote, if you fancy yourself a conservative and safety-conscious pilot, but you bend the rules, you're lying to yourself. For context, he says, it's my wife's and my 9-year anniversary today. Congratulations on that. So last night we flew from Mount Pleasant, South Carolina to Nashville for the day, and that was lunch at Ripley's Barbecue, the best barbecue in the South. I was tempted today to violate the FAR 8-hour alcohol rule and literally thought to myself, quote, that's such a restrictive rule. I don't have to do a whole 8 hours. I know myself better than the FAA does. I'm 6 hours from takeoff time. I can easily just have 1. Then Max's voice came booming across the speakers in my head. So you fancy yourself a safe pilot, eh? I will tell you, sir, sweet tea doesn't go as well with barbecue as beer does, but at least I can say I didn't break the rules. Well, Ed, I love that story. Thanks so much for sharing that with us. And my guess is that it wasn't all that inconvenient to follow the rules. So people, let's follow the rules and in the process, make all of us a little safer and hopefully reduce the accident rate. And now I'd like to share a recording from Bobby, and I'd like to preface it by saying the main reason I started this show over 7 years ago was to share some of the daily insights I learned from my experiences giving flight instruction. And my primary goal was to help avoid some accidents and hopefully save a few lives. And I've had 2 people tell me that something I once said saved their life. Here's the second one, according to Bobby.
Hey Max, this is Bobby. I mentioned on Venmo that I thought you might have saved my life, so I'll tell you the story. Recently I was doing some night touch and goes at my local Bravo, and I started on the quiet runway, but at one point they had to switch me over to the busy runway, and they cleared me in front of a Gulfstream on 7 Mile final, and 7 miles in a Gulfstream sounds like nothing to me, so I was a little rushed. I kind of flew my downwind a little too close and had a bit of a tailwind on base. So as I was turning on to final, I noticed I was going to overshoot a little bit. And for a split second in my head, I thought about doing what everyone knows you're not supposed to do. It's like I could tighten up this turn and make it, but for some reason I started hearing your voice in my head, reading an accident report that you've unfortunately read many times, and decided probably wasn't going to let you finish this one, so I just continued my stabilized turn, re-intercepted final, and a safe landing. So I just wanted to thank you for being that voice in my head and probably being that voice in a lot of people's heads. So thank you.
Bobby, thanks so much for sharing that story. And if you have a story where Aviation News Talk may have saved your life, or if you have anything else you'd like to share, please record it and send it to me. To do that, just go out on the web to aviationnewstalk.com, click on Listener Question at the top of the page. That'll take you to the SpeakPipe app where you can record up to 90 seconds and it will be sent to me automatically. Or you can record directly on a smartphone. On the iPhone, you can just use the voice memo app and then email that to me at max@aviationnewstalk.com. And I'll be back in a moment to tell you about my current 8-day Vision Jet trip around the country and where I'm recording this from. But first, let me ask you, are you flying an airplane equipped with the Garmin G1000 Perspective or the G3000 or G5000? If so, do you know everything there is to know about the system and its autopilot? I'm sure you've read the POH for your airplane from cover to cover, but have you done that for your avionics? Even if you know a lot about the G1000 or G3000 and the autopilot, there's probably more to learn. And you certainly don't want to be struggling to figure out the nuances of the system as you're flying in the clouds. People who've read my books tell me they are much easier to read than the Garmin manuals. Plus, they have a great index, so it's easy to look up any feature you're trying to figure out. To truly master a plane, you have to also master the avionics. So call to get my Max Truscott's G1000 and Perspective Glass Cockpit Handbook or my Max Truscott's G3000 and G5000 Glass Cockpit Handbook. The former is $34.95 and the latter is $44.95. Commit to doing that now and call 800-247-6553 to order. Now, this show may be a little shorter than usual as I'm recording this entire episode from my hotel room in beautiful downtown Naples, Florida. I'm on an 8-day Vision Jet trip with Mega supporter Kevin Hendrickson, who recently completed his SF50 type rating, and we're doing his 25 hours of SOE or Supervised Operating Experience in combination with his business trip. We left Oakland on Saturday, spent the night in Amarillo, Texas, and then on Sunday flew to Bedford, Mass, with a refueling stop at KIND, the Indianapolis airport. And something funny happened when we landed in Bedford and pulled up to the Jet Aviation FBO. Kevin was out of the plane while I was doing some finish-up work inside the plane. He was asked about our rental car, and he said, "It's either under my name or Max Truscott's name." At which point the line guy said, "I thought that was Max Truscott." So a big shout out to Evan Kelly, who listens to Aviation News Talk and works on the line at Jet Aviation. I guess he recognized the mustache through the window, and since we landed in a Cirrus, put two and two together. I talked with Evan for a while and learned that he's a student pilot who's getting close to doing his first solo. So Evan, nice to have met you and keep up the good work. Now, the following day, I drove out to Connecticut and had lunch with my friend and co-host of the Airplane Geeks podcast, Max Flight. Now, I talk with Max just about every week on the podcast, but I hadn't seen him in person since 2019, so it was great to spend a couple of hours with him. I then drove back the long way through Rhode Island. I've been to Rhode Island before by virtue of driving through it long ago on Interstate 95, but I had never stopped there and knew very little about the state. So I decided to use the little time I had to visit Newport, which is on the coast, and I took the cliff walk that goes in front of some of the huge mansions that were built over 100 years ago as summer homes for some of the then richest families in America. Now, you can tour some of them, though I arrived a little too late to do that, but it was fun to see these huge homes and enjoy a walk along the beautiful shoreline. We then flew to Tampa, where we spent one night, and now I'm in Naples, where we'll spend 3 nights. And the highlight of visiting Naples was getting to meet up with mega supporter Dr. Dylan Caldwell in his office right at the Naples airport, where he gives pilot medical examinations. He also has an office that's just a couple of miles from the Pompano Beach Airport. We talked about a number of potential show topics and about his passion for gliders. He owns a Piper Pawnee that he uses to tow gliders, and he also has a glider self-launch winch. Anyway, if you need a basic med, first, second, or third class flight physical, you can contact him at aviatorsclinic.com. And by the way, teenagers 17 and under do not pay for flight physicals. And on Saturday, we'll start working our way back to the West Coast. All in all, it's been a really great trip. In a moment, we'll be talking about that crash of a beach Bonanza in Kentucky. But first, I wanted to ask for your help. This is a listener-supported show, and it's really the support from people such as you that lets me take time off from teaching, which is my primary job, to spend time researching and producing this show for you. And it takes a lot of time, easily 20 hours per episode. So I'd like to invite you to join the club now and become part of the community that makes this all possible. And it's easy to do. Just stop what you're doing and go out to the web to aviationnewstalk.com/support. And I bet you've said, oh, I'll do that later. But have you actually gotten around to doing it yet? Sometimes we just never get around to later. So please do it now. Go out to aviationnewstalk.com/support, where you'll find 4 different ways that you can donate to support the show. And if you choose to donate via Patreon, you'll get some goodies at the various contribution levels. And regardless of the paid level you choose, you get access to a different version of this show where you won't hear me asking you again to support the show. And of course, when you do, I'll read your name on the show. Thanks so much for your help. And aviation is a very small community, so take a listen and see if you know any of these people who've signed up in the past week to help support Aviation News Talk. Thanks to our new Patreon supporter, Wurzel Parzan Kier. He signed up at the $35 a month level, so he also has access to all of my online courses. Thanks so much. We also have a new monthly PayPal supporter, thanks to James Samuel. We had one donation via Venmo. Thank you, Jim Sclafini. And finally, we had a one-time supporter via PayPal, which was Andrew Nakunji. Thanks so much to all these people and to everyone who supports the show in whatever way you do. Coming up next, we'll talk about the crash of November 84 Romeo, a Beech A36 that crashed in Kentucky after its pilot, who was a surgeon, broke multiple FAA rules, crashed, and unfortunately died. All right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And now let's talk about a tragic crash that occurred in 2022 in Tennessee that, like many crashes we've discussed, was completely avoidable. First, my heart goes out to the pilot's family. I just can't imagine the loss they feel. And as you know, we talk about these accidents so that hopefully we can help you in your decision-making so that you'll recognize similar situations and hopefully avoid making the kinds of decisions made by this pilot. The final NTSB report is out, and as you'll hear as I read this accident has some of the same themes that we've talked about recently as we've talked about other accidents. The main underlying theme is what I would call a reckless disregard for following the rules of aviation, and that it was done by someone who was clearly intelligent and accomplished in their field. The pilot was a physician, age 55, and let me tell you a little about him. According to his obituary, he leaves behind a wife and 2 children. It says that he was known not only for his skill as a surgeon, but for his humility, kindness, and his terrific sense of humor. It says he loved a hobby, and throughout his life, he passionately pursued piano, guitar, radio DJing, flying, dirt bike riding, running, hiking, and tennis. His greatest joy was watching his children grow and develop their own passions. He was also a thoughtful and committed longtime member of the recovery community. The purpose of this flight was to attend to his patients for scheduled appointments at a medical office near the destination airport. He had frequently flown into the airport, which is located in mountainous terrain. Upon arrival in the destination airport area, the pilot announced over the airport's common traffic advisory frequency that he would circle to land. There were no further communications recorded from the pilot. Flight track data revealed that the airplane completed a total of 3 approaches to the runway. The weather conditions reported at the time of the approaches were low instrument flight conditions. The pilot did not file a flight plan nor communicate with ATC during the flight after departing under VFR. The airport had one published GPS circling instrument approach procedure. The airplane's flight path and altitude were not consistent with that approach, and the weather conditions were far below the published minimums for the approach. There was no record of the pilot receiving a weather briefing before the flight, and it's not known what information he might have reviewed. And as if that weren't enough, there's even more, which we'll get to in a moment. The report says that it's possible that the pilot's decision to conduct the flight was in part influenced by his scheduled appointments with his patients, which would have increased the external pressures to complete the approach to landing. And it cites the pilot's poor judgment and anti-authority attitude for not following the rules. Here are more of the details. On November 3rd, 2022, about 10:09 a.m., a Beech A36 aircraft, November 84R Romeo, was destroyed when it impacted terrain at the Tucker Guthrie Memorial Airport, that's I-35 in Harlan, Kentucky. The private pilot was fatally injured. According to his family and airport personnel, the pilot frequently flew into the accident airport for work. The pilot was a physician and was scheduled to see patients on the day of the accident. The airplane departed from the Knoxville Downtown Airport, that's DKX, in Knoxville, Tennessee at about 9:32 a.m. There was no record of a flight plan or weather briefing for the flight, nor was there any communication with ATC. The flight track was consistent with the route of flight the pilot had entered into for flight. Review of archived audio recordings of the I-35 Common Traffic Advisory frequency found that as the pilot entered the traffic pattern, he stated, Harlan Tucker Guthrie Bonanza 84 Romeo is 2.5 to the west, will circle for landing, Harlan Tucker Guthrie. There were no further communications. Flight track data revealed that the airplane completed a total of 3 approaches to the runway. The weather conditions reported at the time of the approaches were low IFR conditions. Based upon hourly weather observations at the airport, surveillance video, and a pilot-rated witness located at the airport, visibility was likely restricted to 200 to 300 feet due to fog and low clouds. The flight track data revealed that the airplane completed 3 approaches and maneuvers over the airport environment. At 9:58 a.m., the airplane flew over runway 8 and made a slight right turn followed by a left 180-degree teardrop turn. This was the first pass over runway 8. About 10 a.m., the airplane flew over runway 26 on an extended centerline before it made another left teardrop 180 degrees back toward runway 8. At about 10:02, the airplane made a second pass over runway 8 before it made a slight right turn again and another left 180-degree teardrop turn. About 10:05 a.m., the airplane flew over runway 26 on a longer extended centerline before it made another left 180-degree teardrop turn to intercept an extended centerline course for runway 8. This was the third and final approach to runway 8. On this third and final approach, the airplane impacted a ravine and steep rock wall about 50 feet below the runway elevation and 375 feet short of the runway threshold. The runway sat on top of a rising terrain with a valley below. Based on this information, it's likely that the pilot descended below the runway elevation on final approach, which resulted in the pilot's controlled flight into terrain while searching for the runway environment. According to a pilot-rated witness that was at the I-35 airport terminal, he heard the accident airplane complete 2 approaches to runway 8. He did not visually observe the accident airplane due to fog and low clouds. The first approach seemed to be high, and the second approach sounded really low. For both passes, the witness reported that the engine noise was a steady piston engine sound with no noticeable increases or decreases in power. After the second pass, the witness assumed that the airplane had performed a missed approach. The engine sound became more distant from the airport, and he did not hear the accident airplane again, nor did he hear the accident airplane's eventual impact with terrain. Review of the pilot's electronic logbook found that his most recent flight review and IPC were completed on March 30th, 2021. In the prior 6 months, the pilot logged 3 instrument approaches. The last flight logged was on October 28th, 2022. The pilot did not meet the instrument currency requirements as prescribed in FAA 61.57 recent flight experience, which in part required the completion of 6 instrument approaches. The investigation further revealed recent commercially available flight track data for the accident airplane and recent flights the pilots had logged to I-35. The review identified that the pilot routinely landed at I-35 when the airport was reporting instrument IFR conditions or low IFR conditions. The flight track approaches varied, however, multiple flights displayed a similar circling maneuver and approach to runway 8 as in the accident flight. On September 27, 2022, the pilot completed a flight to I-35 and landed at 9:50 a.m. The METARs published around the time of the approach indicated IFR conditions. The METAR nearest to the time of landing observed a broken cloud ceiling at 100 feet and 10 statute miles of visibility. Flight track data showed that the flight completed a similar circling approach pattern over I-35 as compared to the accident flight. However, the flight landed after the second approach to runway 8. The flight track was not consistent with the published GPS Alpha instrument approach procedure. Within the 90 days before the accident, a total of 4 flights were identified in which the pilot was able to land by circling over the airport under IFR or low IFR weather conditions. The approaches were likely conducted under VFR and into IMC, given that the altitudes and flight track flown were not consistent with published instrument approach procedures. On September 6, 2022, the pilot completed a flight and landed at 10:48 a.m. The METARs published at the time indicated broken ceiling of 500 feet and 10-mile visibility. Review of the flight track showed that the pilot completed a straight-in approach to landing that was not consistent with the GPS Alpha approach. On September 1st, the same thing again. The METARs at the time showed a broken ceiling of 300 feet and 10 statute miles of visibility. And on August 30, 2022, a similar flight landing at 9:12 a.m. And on August 28, 2018, an additional notable flight to I-35 was identified in the pilot's logbook. The flight track was not available. The logbook remarks entry stated that the weather conditions at I-35 were IFR, with the cloud ceilings reported at 100 feet and visibility at 1/4 statute miles. The remarks further stated that he conducted a flyby to check the ceiling at I-35 and confirm the weather conditions. He then diverted to 1 Alpha 6 Airport. The logbook remarks stated IFR at I-35 did a flyby to check ceilings, reported at 100 feet and 1/4 mile viz, confirmed and went back to 1 Alpha 6. According to METAR observations around the time of the accident, the I-35 airport was experiencing low IFR. Review of METARs at I-35 found that from 8:15 a.m. to 10:55, the visibility was less than 1/4 mile and the ceiling was overcast 200 feet AGL. About 11:15 a.m., about 1 hour after the accident, the I-35 METAR reported VFR conditions with the visibility improving to 10 statute miles and scattered clouds at 200 feet AGL. Based on airport surveillance camera data, the estimated visibility was limited to about 175 feet due to fog and low clouds. An additional image was provided that displayed improved visibility about an hour and a half after the accident. The pilot-rated witness reported that near the time of the accident, the weather conditions were very foggy. He reported that he could see no farther than the south runway edge area and the red 8-26 runway sign from the terminal fueling area. As measured with aerial imagery, this distance was about 250 to 300 feet. According to the FAA chart supplement, I-35 is located in mountainous terrain. The airport sat atop a mined and flattened mountaintop at an elevation of 1,563 feet. The terrain below was an elevation of 1,172 feet. The airport has one runway, 8-26, which is 3,461 feet long and 75 feet wide. The airport is equipped with a light beacon, and runway 8 was equipped with runway end identifier lights. Approaching runway 8, the terrain featured a steep rock wall ravine about 350 feet below the runway threshold. I-35 has one published instrument approach procedure. The GPS Alpha was offset from the runway heading by about 10 degrees. The circling minimum descent altitude was 2,920 feet, which is 1,356 feet above ground level. The pilot's flight track and maneuvering over the airport was not consistent with this instrument approach procedure. At the time of the accident, a NOTAM was in effect noting that all airport lighting was out of service. All major portions of the aircraft were located. A post-impact fire consumed a majority of the cockpit, fuselage, and portions of the left wing. Post-accident examination of the airframe and engine discovered no pre-impact mechanical malfunctions or failures. So far we have a pilot that wasn't instrument current and routinely flew in IMC without a clearance. Now let's get to the toxicology report. Toxicology testing performed for the coroner's office was positive for methamphetamine in the pilot's brain tissue. Methamphetamine is a Schedule II controlled substance that is a central nervous system stimulant. It is medically indicated to treat attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, narcolepsy, and obesity. Methamphetamine has a high potential for abuse, and providers are cautioned to sparingly prescribe the medication and not to prescribe methamphetamine to combat fatigue or replace rest in normal persons. The use of methamphetamine may impair the ability to engage in hazardous activities, such as driving a motor vehicle. The FAA does not allow a medical certificate to be issued if the pilot is using methamphetamine. The stimulant phentermine was detected in his liver, brain, kidney, and muscle and lung tissue. Phentermine is a Schedule IV prescription medication indicated for treating obesity in patients with a body mass index of 30 kilograms per meter squared or greater. Phentermine is a stimulant and has similar activity to amphetamines. There is a risk for abuse and dependence, and so should be only prescribed as a short-term adjunct for weight reduction. Adverse reactions can include overstimulation, dizziness, insomnia, tremor, and headache. Phentermine may impair the ability to operate machinery or drive a motor vehicle. The FAA does not allow a medical certificate to be issued if the pilot is using phentermine. The autopsy also identified a sedating antihistamine and a non-sedating cough suppressant in the pilot's liver. It says that the sedating antihistamine that was detected is available over the counter to temporarily relieve symptoms of allergies and colds such as runny nose or watery eyes. The FAA provides guidance on wait times before flying after using that medication. Post-dose observation time is 60 hours, which would be 2.5 days the pilot would have to wait after using it, and it notes the medication is not for daily use. Now, in talking about this accident, the NTSB chose to focus on one of the FAA's hazardous attitudes, which is anti-authority. Though I think there's much more to this accident than that one attitude, and I'll touch on that in a moment. The NTSB wrote in part, being fit to fly depends on more than a pilot's physical conditions and recent experience. For example, attitude affects the quality of decisions. Hazardous attitudes contribute to poor pilot judgment, but can be effectively counteracted by redirecting the hazardous attitude so that correct action can be taken. Recognition of hazardous thoughts is the first step toward neutralizing them. After recognizing a thought as hazardous, the pilot should label it as hazardous, then state the corresponding antidote. Antidotes should be memorized for each of the hazardous attitudes so they automatically come to mind when needed. The antidote provided for anti-authority was follow the rules, they are usually right. The report also quoted the NTSB's Safety Alert SA-23 called Manage Risk. Good decision-making and risk management practices are critical. It says in part, ineffective risk management or poor aeronautical decision-making can be associated with almost any type of fatal GA accident. It says, develop good decision-making practices that will allow you to identify personal attitudes that are hazardous to safe flying, apply behavior modification techniques, recognize and cope with stress, and effectively use all resources. Understand that effective risk management takes practice. It's a decision-making process by which you can systemically identify hazards, assess the degree of risk, and determine the best course of action. Be honest with yourself and your passengers about your skill level and proficiency. Refuse to allow external pressures, such as the desire to save money or time or the fear of disappointing passengers, to influence you to attempt or continue a flight in conditions in which you are uncomfortable. And this one definitely applies in this case. It says, be honest with yourself and the FAA about your medical condition. If you have a medical condition or are taking any medication, do not fly until your fitness for flight has been thoroughly evaluated. Now, in my opinion, there are a few other psychological factors that may have come into play with this accident and with some other recent ones we've discussed. Now, see if any of these might occasionally creep into your life and make sure that they don't roll over into your flying activities. One is risk-taking tendencies. Pilots, like many people in high-stakes professions, can develop a propensity for risk-taking, and they may engage in risky behavior in other aspects of their lives. As pilots, we sometimes underestimate the riskiness of breaking the rules and overestimate our capabilities of flying in challenging circumstances. In this case, the pilot's decision to fly an IMC without a clearance clearly indicated a willingness to take on risks that most of us as pilots would consider unacceptable. We also talked recently about normalization of deviance. If a pilot routinely violates FARs without experiencing negative consequences, well, they can become desensitized to the risk associated with such behavior. And that normalization of deviance can create a false sense of security and lead to continued rule breaking. And sadly, what often breaks that cycle of rule breaking is an accident. And of course, then it's too late to learn the lesson unless the pilot survives. Another factor is overconfidence. People who are intelligent and highly accomplished in one field may generalize and feel that they're extremely capable in all fields of endeavor. And that can lead to a sense of overconfidence in their abilities that leads them to believe that they can safely disregard certain rules or regulations without consequences. This overconfidence bias can cloud judgment and lead to risky decision-making. Here's the probable cause. The NTSB determined the probable cause to be the pilot's visual flight rules flight into IMC during an approach to land at an airport in mountainous terrain, which resulted in controlled flight into terrain. Contributing to the accident was the pilot's hazardous anti-authority attitude. Now let me talk about our mega supporters. Now these are the people who do the heavy lifting and provide about a third of all the support for the show. And after 2 months as a mega supporter, they get a signed book from me. Thanks so much to our 3 top-level supporters, Kevin Hendrickson, who's just bought a share of a VisionJet. Congratulations. Roy Williams, he's a VisionJet owner in Southern California who runs ASAP Home Health that provides in-home nursing services in SoCal and also trains family members to become nurses. And Mike Mendaburo from Palm City, Florida. And then our next tier, we've got 6 folks, Dylan Caldwell. He's a senior AME with offices in Naples and Pompano Beach, Florida, and teenagers 17 and under do not pay for flight physicals. So if you need a basic med for second or third class physical, you can contact him at aviatorsclinic.com. And in his spare time, he tows gliders in a Piper Pawnee. Jonathan Weisswasser, he's a vascular surgeon who has built an RV-8 and now flies a Cessna Mustang. Derek Doyle, he's an Irish-based ATP who also flies helicopters and gyroplanes, and he's a CFI and pilot examiner. Frank Steves. Dane Jasper, who flies at TBM out of Santa Rosa, California. And Travis Wathen, who started a nonprofit, mbs4avi.com, that helps to educate those in the aviation industry about overall health. He and his wife are also in the process of creating a school for inner-city youth to train them on the process of building an aircraft. Now for our mega supporters, those folks who are at the $50 a month level, thanks to Victor Vogel, who lives in Central PA and flies a Cirrus. Matt Souza, he's a private pilot flying a 172 out of Chicago Executive. Tim Delaney, who we just heard from, he's happily retired in Eagle, Idaho, and flies a Turbo SR-22 out of the Nampa Airport. Stephen Elop flies a Turbo 182 and a Citation CJ3+. He's now the CEO of Digital.ai, a company focused on enterprise agile software development tools. Kent Mazia, he and his wife Misty own a 2007 Cirrus at the Alpine Air Park in Wyoming and have a passion for helping others by flying volunteer missions for Angel Flight. Seth Lake, you know him. We've had him on the show numerous times. He's a DPE giving check rides in Arkansas. You can find out more about him or schedule a check ride at VSL Aero. Rick Miller, he teaches full-time in Cincinnati, and he's the chief pilot at the Lunken Flight Training Center. Carl and Ann Rossi of Maine Cooncat Aviation. They've got a pair of Cessna T240s and a 2021 Piper M350. Johnny McDade, singer-songwriter, musician, and record producer. Jim Goldfuss, he's a CFI, CFII, teaching in Long Island at the Republic Airport at Long Island Aviators. He also provides simulator training, and he can also provide you ground training via Facebook. You can find him on his Facebook page at Ground.9. Jim Hopp, he's a CFI. I see him all the time at the Palo Alto Airport, where he teaches at Advantage Aviation and specializes in tailwheel instruction. Joseph Sheehan, who flew in the Navy for 8 years, he now has a couple of hundred hours in his new VisionJet. William Birch, he donates to the show in the memory of his son, Lieutenant J.G. Wallace Birch, who was a naval aviator. Don Hakela, he's with Professional Instrument Courses. They conduct 10-day instrument courses, IFR finish-up, and IFR refresher courses. You can find them at iflyifr.com. Stephen Bush, we've had him here on the show. He's the owner of Lone Star Helicopters in Lago Vista, Texas. He does a lot of add-on ratings from fixed wing to helicopter in his R44, and he gives Bell Series insurance audit training for recurrent and initial training. You'll find him at LoneStarHeli.com. Don Delman, he's recently retired from running an airline flight department. He's a CFI, flies a Bonanza, and he's a new Cirrus CSIP instructor. John Tosto, he's an attorney from Flint, Michigan, and a member of the Greater Flint Pilots Association and a co-owner of a Cherokee 6. Vic Bajaj, who flies here in the San Francisco Bay Area. Tim Crawford, he's a CFI with Crosswinds Aviation at the Oakland County Airport north of Detroit. He owns a VTEL Bonanza and runs a company called BrainSpring that helps kids with dyslexia. Ed Kelly, who I talked with by phone recently, he flies a Saratoga out of Mount Pleasant, South Carolina, and he says his son Bennett is the best co-pilot he could have. Jeff Brausch. Michael Ron, he runs a small wealth management firm in The Woodlands, Texas, which you can find at thesumplanning.com, and he's thinking about buying a Cirrus. Ted Cussall lives in Arizona and flies an SR-22 TG5. Marlon Dutra works in tech in the Bay Area and just recently took delivery of his Diamond DA62. Greg Campbell is a high-tech entrepreneur from Ottawa, Canada, flying a DA40NG and working on his instrument rating. John Sendak, hospital executive in the New York metro area. He flies a SR-22 G6 based at the Republic Airport on Long Island, currently working on his commercial. Rob Thomas, he lives near Atlanta and flies a Cessna 182 with a Texas Skyways conversion. Ed Perry lives in Austin, Texas, and flies a 182 out of the Georgetown Airport. Jim Winter flies an SR-20 G3. Daniel Maddox, who we should be talking with over the weekend here, flies a G36 out of KMKC and 18AZ. Jim Gray from iRecover Treatment Centers. John Trowbridge is a doc in Humboldt, Texas, and flies his 4 Air Coupes. Dan Morris, he's a cardiovascular ICU nurse by day and commercial pilot by night, currently working on his CFI with a goal to fly charter, fractional, or medevac. Wesley Shutt. Rick Crockett flies a 172 XP with a 210 conversion and 29-inch bush tires. He also flies a Cirrus out of Henderson, Nevada, and he's buying a Bonanza F-33. Arjan Gururaj, he's an MD who flies a 2021 G6 Cirrus SR-22T out of North Las Vegas, and his goal is to land at every Bravo airport in the U.S. Dan Sweeney, he's a student pilot working on his private in an SR-20 at the Mike Goulian Aviation Flight School in Bedford, Mass. Sean Murray, he's a private pilot in South Africa who mostly flies a B-55 Baron and an R-44. Brian Pullman and Jeff Casson, they fly out of Morristown and Somerset airports in New Jersey, and they're partners in business compliance services that specializes in fingerprint services for the gaming, sports betting, and financial industries. Arturo Guerra, who we've had on the show, he donates in the memory of his son, Arturo Jr., and he owns a software company that's created a solution for EAPIS called FlashPass. That's for folks who are going through customs internationally in their GA aircraft. You can find more about it at flashpass.net. Nick Passmore, he's a student pilot training and a warrior in Vancouver, Australia. Jim Brosfield, who's a doctor in Tennessee. Renato Steinberg, founder and CEO of a customizable credit card called Clutch. And Renato says he'll give listeners who sign up a one-time $20 credit if they use the promo code MAX. Their website is Clutch, that's with a K, clutchcard.com. Tyler Watley flies a 172 and has a Cirrus on order. Ron Peterson, who's from Utah. Drew Anderson is a dermatologist who flies a Cherokee 235 out of Anderson, Indiana. He's working on his instrument rating and is looking to buy a Cirrus. Shane McFarland, he's the mayor of Murfreesboro, Tennessee, and since he flies, he calls himself the Air Mayor. Bill Haug flies out of High Sierra Pilots in Carson City and Minden, Nevada. He's working on his CFI and hopes to become a father-son flight instruction team. Joey McCormick, insurance agent and ground instructor in Arkansas. If you live in Arkansas or an adjacent state, call him for a quote on life insurance that covers your private pilot flights. Check him out at flexiblechoiceinsurance.com. Hunter Clark, who's from N-Flight Cam. They make accessories for GoPros. Chris Waters. Kimberly Coons, instrument-rated pilot working on commercial and also multi-engine. Eric Hines runs a new nonprofit called Hope on Short Final that does emergency relief supply flights in response to weather disasters. You can read more about their mission at hopeonshortfinal.org. William McKinney. Miles Tedder working on his instrument rating. He just bought a 2020 Cirrus SR-20. Ed Carrolls. Philip Dade, who owns a handful of restaurants in Arizona and Utah. Shannon Day has completed his private instrument ratings in the past year at the Scottsdale, Arizona Cirrus Factory Training Center and is building hours and experience in his Cirrus SR-22T while continuing to work on additional ratings and eventually becoming a jet pilot. Scott Sutton, Peter White, Patrick Bennett, and David Ford. He flies Cirrus SR-20s out of Leesburg, Virginia, and is working on his instrument rating. Robert Emery. Aaron Elder, he and his partners have an SF-50 Vision Jet available for rent at Apogee Air at the Oakland International Airport in Oakland County, Michigan. Tom Higgins, he's a student pilot in an SR-20 at All-In Aviation at Henderson, Nevada. Christopher Cole. And Pilot Life, they offer a digital logbook which you can find at pilotlife.com. And Atticus Tyson, he flies a Cirrus SR-22T out of the San Francisco Bay Area. Andrei Tikhonov. Jeff Noiseau, he describes himself as a 70-year-old student pilot who enjoys aviation news talk. And just a reminder that I love hearing from you, and I read many of your emails on the show. If you'd like to send me a message, just go out to aviationnewstalk.com, click on Contact at the top of the page. That's absolutely the best way to send me a message. And of course, I also want to thank everyone who supports the show in one of the following ways. We love it when you join the club and sign up at aviationnewstalk.com/support. To support the show financially, you can also do that at aviationnewstalk.com/PayPal. We also love it when you leave a 5-star review on whatever app that you're listening to us on now. And of course, if you're in the market for a headset, please consider buying a Lightspeed headset and using one of the links in our show notes, because if you use those links, they will donate to help support the show. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up. And remember that you can always go around.
You can always go around if it don't look right coming down. Don't wait until your side's baby sliding upside down. You can always